joining us today at our 12:30 start time. I think we've got you all trained to be here at 12:15, so I apologize for those who've expected the normal routine, and thank you for your patience. My name is Patrick Doherty. I'm the director of the U.S. Cuba Policy Initiative here at the New America Foundation. Steve Clemons, as you know, was scheduled to host and moderate this event. He sends his deepest regrets. He got called away to Jordan and caught whatever it was that I had last week, and he's trying to nurse himself together before hopping on a very long plane ride tonight. So he sends his apologies. He wishes he could be here. He sends his apologies to Anne, and he's looking forward. He may even be watching, overwatching here on the web. Just so you know, we're all being webcast today. So, but you know. Doing any kind of event on Cuba policy at this time is just a real pleasure. Having Louise Bardach to kind of be able to pick her brain is a real pleasure at this point. The issue is just so vibrant, so alive, so dynamic right now. And Anne has been one of the few authors who've been able to really read the tea leaves in both Miami and Havana with both authority and a depth of understanding and a set of contacts and sources that is just really an important part of fleshing out the story and providing the color. And the color that she's provided has really made this Cuba story a compelling story for whether you're a wonk like a lot of us in the room or average Americans who may not be so compelled to see characters whose either hair is graying or wearing colostomy bags. So this has just been really great, and it's a great contribution, and it's great storytelling. The way we've decided to structure the conversation today is to really have it be a give and take. What I've asked Anne to do is to do just to set up the book. How did it come about? What was she trying to do? Some of her major conclusions, and then we're going to get into a more of a conversation here on the dais, and then bring the group in, and so we can have a real dialogue about a lot of these hot issues that are facing us on the Cuba front. And a couple of housekeeping notes. I've actually removed my cell phone from my pocket because it never seems to turn off. So if I can ask all of you to turn off your ringers, that would be really great. And when you do get a microphone, please, or if you do have a question, please wait for the microphone, identify yourself, and then ask your question. Okay? So without further ado, let me introduce Anne. Anne Louise Bardach is the author of Without Fidel. Here it is. Here's the cover. Without Fidel, A Death Foretold in Miami, Havana, and Washington, and the acclaimed Cuba Confidential, Love and Vengeance in Miami and Havana. She is the PEN USA award-winning reporter and a contributing editor at Vanity Fair. Has written for the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, The Atlantic, and Slate. She's appeared on 60 Minutes, Today, and The Today Show, and CNN, among others. She's a member of the core group of the Brookings Cuba Task Force, and teaches at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And started reporting, I believe, was it 1992 on Cuba? Yeah. Cuban exiles. And has just been continuing and been a real asset to helping all of us understand what's really going on in this complex and dysfunctional relationship we've got. So, Anne, without further ado, thank you so much, and please help me welcome Anne Louise Bardach.
I don't know if that's not going to work there, is it? Okay, right there. Okay. Well, all right. Thank you, Patrick, and thanks, Steve Clemons, wherever you are. I hope you're well in Jordan. Boy, traveling with a flu to Jordan, my. And thank you all for coming, and New America for having me. I'm looking out at this crowd here, and I'm realizing this is a pretty sophisticated crowd. So I'm going to kind of change what I normally have been doing here. Why don't I start out by telling, in other words, I don't think you all need sort of the primer 101, but why don't I start out by just telling you a little bit about the writing of this book. And for those of you who know, I apologize. But in 2005, 2006, I think it was, I was working on an article. The way my articles, if you know anything about my work, they tend to all to get kind of exhaustive. I begin pieces and they just go on and on and on. Sort of like coal mining with me. I don't know. Anyway, so I was working on a piece that was supposed to be a couple weeks, and of course, as usual, turned into much longer than that. And it was focused on the case of Luis Posada Carriles and his friend and comrade Orlando Bosch. And what I really wanted to sort of look at was the case of the Cubana shoot-down, this horrific act of terrorism in 1976. I was just so puzzled, when 9/11 came, and we were also horrified about planes, civilian planes coming down. A lot of people in this country, around the world, didn't realize that the first act of airline terrorism in our hemisphere, at least, was in October 1976. And I was fascinated by how this case and the perpetrators, how there was never any really satisfying adjudication. There had been some arrests, they did some time in prison, some very long time, but Orlando Bosch ended up in Miami, where he is today, and Luis Posada is also in Miami today. We'll get back to that later, but the point being is I had started this story, and of course, as my stories tend to be, they end up sort of being series and long, and I got deeper and deeper, and by the time I had finished it, I guess the poor editors at Atlantic Magazine, Joy DeManil and Jim Bennett, I think I was supposed to do something like 8,000 words. As usual, I was like at 30,000 words. I'm really an editor's nightmare. And by the time it was over, I thought, I really got a book here, and I've got so much stuff. And at this point, I had tracked down, family members and relatives right here in Washington, the sons of a man named Orlando Garcia, who ran Venezuelan intelligence. I actually found two of them right here in this area, and another son in Miami. And that became extraordinary to me because this Orlando Garcia, who was such a key figure in that investigation and in the entire case, had died. So I thought, well, I was going to make this into a book. And then we all know a very dramatic thing happened. On July 27th, 2006, Fidel Castro became mortally ill. And we saw this amazing thing happen on TV. Carlos Valenciaga, Fidel's devoted secretary, assistant, deputy, appeared on Cuban television and very dourly read that message. Now, of course, that's another long story. We can get to that later, what happened to Valenciaga, along with many other people we all knew in the Cuban government. So what happened is the publisher, Scribner, asked me to, I went to them saying I really wanted to do an extended work on the Cubana shoot-down and take the Atlantic piece and really go with all my sources, etc. And they said, oh, my God, but okay, Fidel Castro has heard the story. So they said, well, listen, this is what we want. What we really want is a meditation on the death of Fidel. He's clearly got days, maybe weeks here. And it will just be, it's a nothing thing. You'll go down to Havana, you'll cover the funeral, and then you'll go to Miami and you'll do a little, you'll do some reaction stuff. It's a kind of 3-4 month project. It's all over. And they said, and by the way, you and your Posada Bosch people, your obsession with that, you can do that too. But you can add that in. But we'll just let's get the funeral over with and written up and properly memorialized. Well, needless to say, Fidel Castro did not die, did he? he's had, so I ended up, this book morphed from being a meditation and a rumination on the death of Fidel into really a trilogy, because the years went by. It wasn't months, it wasn't 40,000 words. And what I decided is, look, I think I'm just going to put all my, all the little thoughts and scraps that I have collected over these 15, 20 years of being in this arena. And again, for me, it began in the Cuban exile. That was the first story I did, was on exile militant activity. Then I got the interview with Fidel Castro, I guess whatever it was, 93, 94. And so I, again, decided that, I was going to make that a central part of the book, which I did. So the first third of the book is called The Long Dying, in which there's everything. There's all kinds of, scraps of funny business. We have late-night comedians making their jokes, and a great deal of medical information, some of which I was able to get out of Havana, and some of which I was able to piece together through sources also in Spain, and some surgeons who pioneered the surgery that Fidel Castro did have. And so I think it's fairly comprehensive in that regard. And I also did a history of his dying. For those of you who don't know, I think he was first declared dead in 1956. A very credulous reporter named Francis McCarthy reported for the UPI. We got it directly from Batista's press organization that Fidel Castro was dead. And so his obituary has been written over and over and over again. I always mention Francis McCarthy because reporters get a lot of trouble for screwing up when they're on the left side, like Herbert Matthews. Many of you might know that Herbert Matthews suffered very, took some grievous wounds. Of course, he made some very serious, he got too close to his source, which is something that no one in journalism can really risk doing, and he did risk it, and he got too identified. But he had done some sensational work, and he was the person who revived the life of Fidel Castro first on. After the UPI said he was dead, Herbert Matthews went down for the New York Times, and of course, had that famous interview in the Sierra Maestra and said, my God, he's alive. And he even said, of course, he was convinced by Castro that he had many more numbers of followers than he actually did. So again, as I said, the second part was the part I thought I was going to be writing on, which is called the Fidel Obsession, and that's sort of a chronicle of his enemies, not all of them, but focusing on Luis Posada and Bosch and the investigation going up to the present. I have some limitations in being able to discuss it because some of you may know that I've been under subpoena for how many years? 3, 4 years? I don't know. I've had so many subpoenas that the joke at our house is my husband said, we're putting out a mailbox that says subpoenas only. I've had I don't even know how many I've had in this case, myself and also the New York Times, because the New York Times is where I published, I was the co-author of a series on the case of Luis Posada. Well, it was many other things, but Posada's the one that got a lot of attention. The third part of the book is Raul Castro. The transition is called Raul's Reign. I'm very fond of that part because one of my passions is Cubaology, Kremlinology of Cuba, and I've had a lot of fun. Working with who's on first and who's on second, who's on third, and who's in the pokey. And in Cuba, it's very easy to go from, they say beware, never be number 3 in Cuba. Never be number 3. Remember what happens to number 3. Carlos Aldana, Roberto Robina, now Felipe Perez Roque. All right, so number 3, beware who wears that hat. So that's an area that endlessly interests me. So what I thought I'd do, because I look out here and I can see that there's some real Cuba heads here, I thought I'd kind of talk about whatever you want me to talk about, but those are the 3, this is really what this book is. It's a trilogy. There's some topics that I love. We could talk about press visas, what we call visa de prensas, how you lose your visa how you even get a visa to go to Cuba, how reporters have been crawling, on shards of glass for years to get visas, and the dog and pony show we go through, and how Cuba maintains and manipulates the media through that. Or how you can lose a press visa, which can happen just like that. And that's getting harder and harder and harder. We could also talk about the Posada case within limitations. There's certain things I cannot discuss because of the pending trial coming in March. Another area I'm really fascinated, if you're fascinated, I hope you are, is the Castro Dynasty. After Fidel, we now have the age of Raul, but there's other Castros throughout the ministry. And I find them quite interesting. If the son of Raul, Alejandro, the son-in-law, the daughter Mariela, who could be a tremendous beacon and a tremendous presence. She is a tremendous presence, and she may move forward. She appears to have some ambitions, and that would be fascinating. So in other words, a lot of people say, what's going to happen after Raul and all that? Well, I see a lot of other Castros around. You have another ministries, nephews, nieces, cousins, Marcos Portal, in another ministry. By the way, if I am saying names and nobody, just raise your hand and say, who's that? And I will certainly take the time to elaborate.
And if I could.
And then one other thing was,
Sure.
was Ramiro Valdez, the return of Ramiro Valdez. What does that mean? And the history of these various purges that we have seen in March and going backwards.
That's exactly where I wanted to start with the March purge.
Okay.
Could you talk about how you see what happened in March with with Felipe Perez Roque and the 25 or so others that all lost their jobs at one level or another?
Yeah.
Could you talk about that, and how does it fit into the larger narrative of the Raul-Fidel relationship? Could you just start there? I think would be a good place to go.
Well, what Patrick is alluding to, for those of you who might not know, is in March of this year, we saw a very profound purge of the Cuban government. We saw the top figures in the Cuban government go from being, let's rattle them off for those of you who don't know. Carlos Laje, vice president, member of the Politburo, has ran the economic situation there, since going back to at least the special period. Felipe Perez Roque, the foreign minister, former head of the FEU, the student unit, personally tutored by Fidel for years, just famous for his devoted slavishness to Fidel. The famous story that I talk about, not in this book, but in Cuba Confidential, is on the night his first child is born. He doesn't run to be with his wife or the newborn child. He spends the night with Fidel because Fidel needs him. Fernando Ramirez. How many of you here in this room remember Fernando Ramirez, who ran the intersection here? And who went back and who was the point man on Elian Gonzalez, who just delivered a tremendous victory for the Cuban government during Elian Gonzalez, went back, became a key figure in the secretariat, gone. On and on and on, Otto Rivero. I mean, there's major figures, at least 12, 15 we know about, but we don't. You got to assume that other people underneath them who worked with them are also gone. Now, what's interesting to me are two things on this purge. One is how little coverage it got. The New York Times wrote actually quite a good story on it, but they what we called buried the lead. It started off with something like with workers' rights, and then somewhere in the middle of it, you realize that these men had been under surveillance. These are the leaders of the government of Cuba, had been under surveillance, according to Raul Castro, for a year. What does that tell you? And I talk about it in this book from a relative of a member of this little group who does this surveillance. They call it Control Interno. But they know this. The leaders of Cuba know their surveillance. But this was in private homes. They're in a finca outside of Havana that was being surveilled, etc. So this tells you a lot about this culture. So what was the purge about? probably the most significant in probably since a scandal called La Dolce Vita, which happened in the 1960s, in which the Cuban government, the same thing happened. This is my personal take on it, is that Raul wanted his people. That's simple. Those were Fidel's people, and you look who took the places. Look who took the key positions. Almost all of them are in the Cuban army. And remember, the way I like to say this is particularly for the uninitiated. How is Cuba running today? It's Raul's army. The army is the CEO, and they have kind of appropriated almost every part of the economy, not just tourism and agriculture, but moving into other areas as well. And now, you could say that's a bad thing, or you could say it's a good thing. The good thing is that the army is the most effective organ in Cuba. What the army does is usually done quite well relative to several of the other institutions. So what clearly happened here was moving out Fidel's people and putting in Raul's people and militarizing it. You can see this. Even Chomi, who was, Fidel's faithful aide, his doctor, his confidant, still a very close friend, is still with him very closely. He was moved out. That was really, he was moved upstairs into a science technology area. He was not purged. But as far as we know, or as I know, if someone knows different, let me know, at least 2 of these guys are in prison. And they're facing treason charges, which can be a capital offense in Cuba. We know that the businessman, what's his name, Conrado Hernandez, he's in prison, or he was, who knows from day to day. And Carlos Laje's cousin, the cardiologist, who was heard. The crime was that he was heard, the cousin said something to the effect that when Ramon Machado Ventura, who was made number 3, beware being number 3, and is an old historico going way back with Fidel and Raul to the early days of the revolution, and is known as sort of a dinosaur or a Taliban guy, as whatever you want to say pejoratively, by the reformer flank, that he made the crack something about it would have been a godsend to the patria if when he came in for heart problems we had sort of let him not recover. And of course, but this is a quip made in a private home. And I understand that he's facing treason. So the others, some are in house arrest. We don't know. Somebody told me the other night that Fernando Ramirez has been seen working in a hospital. Many of these guys were doctors, which is not uncommon. And Fidel Castro has a knack for surrounding himself with people who double as doctors. So I would say that's it. And I would say that's primarily it. Raul finally... He put his men in, and he took out his brother's men, and men that he knew were completely devoted and loyal to him. And I think that would be the basic answer there.
What kind of tension does that set up with Fidel's Young Turks? In his later years, he started to run the country less and less through the ministries and more through his special protégés. To what extent are those protégés waiting in the wings for the next chapter to unfold, or to what extent does Raul have very solid control over enough of the levers of power so that that's not really a risk?
Well, I mean, they started purging the army in the in the late 80s, early 90s with the De La Guardia Ochoa affair. When that was General Ochoa, charismatic, dashing, very highly acclaimed general who worked in Angola, and Tony de la Guardia. 4 of them were executed, reportedly for drug crimes. There's been various questions about that. Certainly they had some shaky behavior and shady behavior, but there's been questions why they were executed. The army has been repeatedly purged and cleaned. Since then, dissident elements have been purged. I really don't. People always say, there could be a coup in Cuba. No way. Security and stability of those institutions come first. First comes the stability and security of the Castro family, then the army, which protects them. And the people who have been put in power, who have really been moved up, are completely on the same page. Castro family and the institutions and the army. They keep a very, I mean, just think about the implications that you take out your 15 of your top people, beginning with your foreign minister, your most public people. The puzzling thing for me is how did Ricardo Alarcón and Abel Prieto survive this? That's the question for me. Is and of course, what does this do? See, to me, this is the most corrosive legacy of the Cuban Revolution, I'm sorry to say. I mean, the most positive thing is the reward of nationalism and identity, and the most negative thing is and corrosive element is the mistrust, sowing suspicion that you never know who's listening, you never know who's watching, you never know when your number's up. I mean, that there really is, I say to myself, what are these poor guys who are working at the mission over here thinking? Our predecessors, they were banished like that. What are they thinking? But, for some amazing reason, the Cubans government maintains a morale. They keep morale up. Their intelligence organ is among the most dedicated. Most of the intelligence operatives work, pro bono. So it's a lot of contradictions going on here. And they obviously remain true believers in these institutions. But there's one indisputable winner, and that is Ramiro Valdez. And if you look at the purges beginning in the 1960s, who was the guiding hand in La Dolce Vita? And people like the Efigenia Amadeus, whose family, he lost 3 brothers in the revolution. His name is on a hospital. I mean, he was moved out of power during that one. So many people we know about. There's been books, most notably by Jovio Menendez, who wrote a wonderful book about it called Insider. And then again, we saw with the case of Carlos Aldana, who was the head of ideology, very, very well regarded. And then we saw it again with the foreign minister, Roberto Robina. So this is a periodic cleansing. And all of them were captured under surveillance, wiretapping, either video or telephones. And what's amazing is they always broadcast it. And who's the hatchet man who delivers the bad news? Always Raul Castro. Raul Castro talks about, how Carlos Aldana shook in front of him. He told Rabina, I told Aldana, we will not tolerate a Gorbachev in this country. There will not be a Cuban Gorbachev. And he talked about how whoever dares to be a Cuban Gorbachev will be hung from a very famous tree that they have in Cuba. He actually identified. And over and over again. So we see Ramiro Valdez has a hand in them, so I am sure he had a hand in these last ones. Who takes the major Politburo seats that vacated? Ramiro Valdez. Who goes to Russia to be the travel mate with Raul Castro to Russia? Ramiro Valdez. So this man has become hugely powerful again after having 10 years of sort of being a little bit in the shadows and shunted over to where he was just working in the Communist Party and developing his portfolio with technology and the internet.
Okay, let's take some questions on this, and then we'll move on to another topic and have a more conversation and then some more questions. Anyone from the field? If you can wait for the microphone.
Yeah.
How old is Valdez is all I'm wondering. How old is Ramiro Valdez?
Ramiro Valdez is one of the surviving quartet who was both at Granma, the landing that Fidel, Che, and Raul landed in Oriente in, 56. He was at Moncada, the assault in 53. And so he's one of the original, there's only 4 left. What is it, Pedro Miret? Because Juan Almeida died a couple of weeks ago. So there's really just Raul, Fidel, Miret, and so he's got to be 77, 78. I'm not exactly sure. It's in the book, I think. There's really nobody. They're pretty much in the 70s and 80s now. I mean, this is a really old crowd. It's kind of sad. I remember on my last trip to Cuba, I got sort of somebody who was pretty big up in Minrex, the foreign ministry, picked me up. He said, I got to go over. You got to go talk to Elder Cohn. And we went over to the National Assembly. And on the way over, I said to this fellow whose name I won't, who's a pretty big figure in the foreign ministry, I said, so who's next? Who's next? He says, oh, everybody says this one and this one. He says, you don't understand. There's so many guys like me in our 40s and 50s. It's our time next, you know? And I think about the heartbreak that they must be feeling. He says, we've done 20 years in the foreign ministry. We've done 20 years in the Ministry of Interior. And I think about what were they thinking? You know, how disappointed they must be. But if you look, you know, it's been pretty much militarized up at those top positions because these are Raul's men. Raul trusts this army. And again, it's not a black and white situation because the army is effective. They've handled tourism quite well. Let me tell you how deeply involved Ramiro Valdez is. He has, officially his portfolio is information, technology, communications. Very big. You know, he spent 10 years really working on computers. One of my sources is one of the most important foreign investors in Cuba. He owns a lot of big properties, does a lot of business in Cuba, has been in business in Cuba since like 65. Very important figure in their economy. He was telling me he was at a building project, and as happens in Cuba, the workers disappeared. You don't know what that means. But for a foreign businessman, this is hell. Went on for a couple weeks, went on for a couple months. He's desperate. He's flying back and forth. You know, how do I get these workers back? You know, I have a huge pit, you know, empty hole in the middle of Havana. What am I going to do? And he's going to minister, nothing. And meanwhile, there's a lot of stealing going on at one of his properties, and he's feeling fairly desperate. Nothing happens until he makes a few phone calls. And what does he do? He gets a letter from Ramiro Valdez. This is a building project saying, you are not to worry, the workers will be there tomorrow. The workers were there the next day. So Ramiro Valdez is not just information, technology, communications. He's handling building permits. This is, and what does that remind you of? It reminds me of Fidel with the micromanaging. I'm doing everything. You know, I'll be here, I'll be there, I'm doing it. So and as long as these guys are fit and healthy, we're going to be seeing them. But, you know, the name Valdez, Ramiro Valdez, and for those of you who don't know, he was most associated with a ferocious movement, you know, a very chilling movement in the 1960s called the UMOP, or the New Man, the Nuevo Hombre, whatever. And, you know, they set up these rehabilitation camps for homosexuals, liberals, people who had their hair was too much afro. You know, that's what they said. Pablo Milanez was picked up as his hair was was inappropriate. And he ran those camps, and people in Cuba have been scared of him ever since. I had one of my major sources was one of his best friends, and I've been told the other side of Ramiro Valdez. But for most Cubans, you say Ramiro Valdez, and people are pretty scared.
Interesting. Other questions? Talking about the purge, Ramiro Valdez. Where I want to go next, I think, Anne, is to really look at, if Raul has kind of secured his team, secured the regime, after Fidel has kind of moved halfway aside, he's been also trying to manage a really desperate economy, made much worse by last year's hurricanes.
That's right.
And he's been slowly rolling out incremental reform after incremental reform.
That's right.
What's the backstory here on this? To what extent, you know, are they really looking at serious? To be hyperbolic about it, are they looking at China?
You bet they are.
And what lessons are they taking? What lessons are they nervous about? And then how does it play into this now delayed party Congress, at which I hear there were going to be some even more reforms coming out? So that was supposed to be this November. It's been delayed on an indeterminate basis. At least I haven't heard a new date set for it. If you can tell that backstory, tell that narrative, how now that they've got their regime more secure, what's the economic pathway? Because they're in a world of hurt.
First of all, you have it exactly right. Stability, security. You know, when Fidel got sick, Raul Castro, there was a piece in Grama where he talked about have no doubt from minute one we were on this. He talked about how they had thousands of volunteers and army people on every street, and everybody I spoke to in Cuba said they have never seen police presence ever since the death of Fidel. The near death. They thought in that week that they thought that he might die, and Fidel himself said he thought he was going to die. That's his own account. He's actually said he does not expect to live past the first administration of Obama. If there is a second one, we don't know. But they immediately secured it. And Raul talked about it. He talked about it, what was it, Operation something. And he says it remains more or less in effect. But that is exactly right. I was quite hopeful when Raul came in because I've known through my sources that he's a much more pragmatic, much less ideological person than his brother. I think his reforms have been significant. I know that the State Department here, especially during the Bush administration, kept sniffing, oh, they're cosmetic. I don't think they were cosmetic. I mean, they may not be as deep and profound as we want, but for Cubans to go into hotels and to be able to use tourist facilities, that's a big deal. That really bothered Cubans that they couldn't go into their own hotels. I'd have to go talk to sources and we'd have to be standing on the beach. I mean, that was infuriated Cubans that they couldn't use tourist facilities. Buying cell phones, computers, people were making jokes about, oh, they can have a pressure cooker, but they have nothing to put in it. But whatever you want, this liberalizing of agriculture, letting Cubans lay hands on this arable land. I mean, that is the crime of Cuba, that it's, this incredibly fertile land and they don't have a diversified agriculture, that they're importing all this rice. I mean, he has addressed that. I mean, Raul has been very, very candid about some of their problems. He has, what's the joke I quote in here? He says, it's supposed to be, I think he says 2 + 2 = 4, but somehow in socialism here, sometimes 2 + 2 = 5 or 3. He actually made a joke about it. And he's been much more candid about the deficiencies, and he has opened it up. But it's an alternating current, and Cubans talk about having whiplash. You never know what's coming down. And so where we've seen an opening in economic issues, and even with the internet, I mean, people have access to the internet. It's very limited. He's adopted sort of the Chinese model, but there's been these whiplashes of repression where we've had people arrested. There was a very interesting thing in the university in Santiago where the students led a protest, and they did not go in and arrest them or physically hurt them initially. They had a discussion. They met some of their demands, and they opened things up. They gave them security. They met some of their demands, and then a few months later, they started picking through the ringleaders and throwing them out of the university. Now, when another university did the same thing a few months later, they said, "Oh no," and they shut them down right away. So, it's they're calibrating it. Always, it is the security and the stability of the government, of the military, certainly the Castro family. So it's a mixed picture, but certainly he's emulating the Chinese and what he also talks about the Vietnamese model.
Do you think that they have a theory for the case beyond increasing agricultural production? Because between that and increasing some basic services like private taxis, there really has not been much in the way of any kind of concerted plan visible. But it's clear that they know, because they're importing 80% of daily caloric intake, that they really need to focus on agriculture, because that's really draining what little cash, foreign reserves that they have. They're already negative. Their credit is terrible. So they've definitely been focusing on agriculture. But agriculture isn't necessarily going to – it's a sine qua non, but but there's got to be more than that. Has there been more?
Well, the big miracle, or what could happen for Cuba is the discovery of oil in the northern straits. Cuba got very lucky. I'll tell you a funny story. I guess in the mid-'90s, I was having dinner in Havana with. It's funny. A guy in the oil ministry, he worked in the oil ministry. Oddly enough, he had the same name. He had a very unfortunate name for a Cuban working in the government. His name was Orlando Bosch. He said this created some problems with him and might have held him back in his career. But he told me at that time, he said, we've been looking for oil forever around here. He says, we don't understand it. We're between Venezuela, Mexico. It doesn't make any sense. We're in there. It's got to be somewhere. I mean, they had small deposits. He says, how could everybody have the mother lode but us? But we've turned over every rock. We've looked everywhere. He says, trust me, we don't have it. I mean, he said, we have these lesser grades. Well, sure enough, finally, Repsol found a major deposit in the northern straits. However, it is extremely deep. It is going to cost a fortune to get that out. The Brazilians, though, are no fools. They showed up in a heartbeat. Lula and the Petrobras guys, they were there, along, of course, with Chavez and the Russians. Everybody is signed up to explore for this. But like I said, it may not be a magic bullet, and sometimes these holes are not. They don't come up pumping as much as you think they will, and it's very, very expensive. And the other problem with the foreign companies in Cuba is Cuba doesn't pay their bills. And that is really annoying. There are a lot of big investors. They owe Sherrod a huge amount of money, but many other companies. And I know from a couple of my sources, it is very frustrating for these guys to do business there. And so there's a lot. They're going to have to improve their economic viability. And like you said, they are really in deep trouble now.
And, if they're staking their economic future on the possibility of oil, is there talk about looking to be Norway and not Angola on this? Is there?
Norway's actually one of the big companies that has signed up to go drill for it. Remember, there's
how they use the revenues is going to be essential in whether they get some purchase.
Could be 5 years before they get a hole drilled.
Are they even talking about this? Are they able to think that long term? Because getting into the oil business is 25-year investments at minimum.
That's
and
right.
They need to be able to talk about that long. But this old regime does not have that long to last.
Well, I'll tell you what the other big bonus for Cuba, and that was they realized the sugar cane, the sugar fields. If they ever get the sugar industry up and going again, look, in a robust fashion, as they once had, sugar for ethanol. And but again, it's management. It's getting people. They've had just a huge problem with, worker morale. I mean, listen, this is the fundamental problem. I mean, I hate cultural stereotypes, but has there ever been more entrepreneurial people than the Cuban people who are more naturally entrepreneurial? What are the big words in Cuba? Inventar, Rissel there. I mean, people, which means to, invent yourself and resolve things. I mean, have we ever known, a nationality more entrepreneurial who've had this kind of steely socialist, it's just an alien thing for Cubans. So it's been always very tricky for them to get people motivated and keep them in the workforce and motivated and keep them out of the black market and it's a very tricky situation, holding the stability, the institutions that they think are vital for the maintenance of the Cuban Revolution. They're gonna start having to give more and more sectors up to the private sector.
Okay. Questions from the floor? In the back and then up here in the front. Thanks.
Brian Friel with National Journal. I was hoping to turn your attention to Washington and sort of get your assessment of how Congress and the administration have been responding to things this year, and whether you see the advantage sort of more with the people who want to liberalize the relationship or more with the people who want to hold the line.
Well, Obama's doing pretty much, he's doing what I expected him to do. He is opening things up, carefully, slowly, judiciously. Now remember, we have big limitations. In 1996, or was it 97, the U.S. embargo was codified by Helms-Burton after the shoot-down of those four planes, the Brothers to Rescue planes. He's hamstrung. If you've ever seen Helms-Burton bill, it's around the size of a phone book. It was put together by a lot of special interests, and everything's in there. The kitchen sink. It's just a nightmare behemoth. However, and this we discussed at Brookings, the Cuba task force that I'm on, there's a huge amount the president can do by executive order, and he has implemented some of them. This morning, a Miami company will lay the first fiber optic cable from Florida to Cuba.
Pending approval from the Cuban government, I think, still.
Oh, is it?
It's not, at least the story that I read last night.
I just looked at the headline this morning.
It's not been approved by Havana yet. So
it hasn't? Well, because there's
been
another
approved
person.
by Treasury.
Treasury has approved it, but it seemed to me they wouldn't go to that stage unless, the competition, of course, is Hugo Chavez says, I'm laying an optic cable from Caracas to Havana. He said that a couple of years ago, but no one's seen the cable yet. But then again, let's not begrudge him. He's giving Cuba oil on terms that would rival Santa Claus. I mean, I got to tell you, Hugo Chavez,
No naughty or nice clause.
He's made the Russians look like, pikers in the patronage department. And on top of it, he speaks the same language. Could anyone get luckier than Fidel Castro? You lose the Russians and you get Hugo Chavez. I mean, does it get better than that if you're Fidel Castro and he's just and you have the leader of an oil-rich country talking about you being the father figure in his life, which Hugo Chavez talks about. This guy's got luck. I don't know why it doesn't happen to other people like it's happened for Fidel. I mean, how he's alive is a miracle. I mean, I'll just mention this thing about the surgery. As some of you know, he's lost most of his intestine. I kind of lay it out here. I kind of reconstructed. I had a very good source in the hospital who helped me a great deal. Very grateful. And his gallbladder, what they call other viscera, which means other organs in the. I know more about the intestinal tract than I've ever wanted to know. And he's had multiple surgeries, 3. He's had at least 2 or 3 bouts of peritonitis. I mean, there's no reason for him to be alive. Absolutely none. He was telling us the honest truth that he thought that was his last day when he went down after the first surgery, which, of course, was a calculated risk that he made. He told the surgeons, don't do it this way, do it this way. And he gambled hard, as was his nature, and he lost hard. But I just want to tell you, this happened to a man in his 80s. And when I was 18 years old at NYU as a young student, I got peritonitis. I was perfectly healthy. Nothing had been wrong with me. I was taken to a Catholic hospital, and they gave me last rites. This man is... That's how serious and how quickly peritonitis can take you out. This is a man who's had probably 3 bouts of it. He's had sepsis, gangrene, you name it. I don't know why he's breathing. And then I had some friends that were with him just last week, and they were telling me, well, he's thin, he's impaired, he doesn't walk very well. I think he's got a cane. I think they mentioned that he needs a cane because of these other injuries from that famous fall. But, his color looks better, they said, and, they could tell when they hugged him, that there was apparatus, because after this kind of surgery he had, you do need some outside help. But he's basically, his complexion looked good, and he was lucid and talking.
Great. Another question here?
Jordi Zamora from Agence France Presse. I just wanted to know what is your, if you have any updated information about the recent contacts to restart the postal service between both U.S. and Cuba, the immigration, and especially, I don't remember her name, but I think there was a quite high official from the State Department.
Bisa Williams.
She was walked around for 2 days, I think.
A week. 6 days.
All right. So, if you could update us a bit more.
Like I said, I think the Obama administration is moving slowly, but they're doing. This is what I think we can expect with Obama. Very quickly, very soon, and probably the next year, U.S. relations will be back to where they were before George W. Bush, like they were in the Clinton years. There'll be a lot of travel. He's opened up Cuban travel for Cuban Americans. I think we will see all those categories come back where pretty much anyone can go. You know, culture, religious. We all know those categories were abused back then, but it's going to be pretty much open. He's not going to just lift the U.S. He can't lift the U.S. embargo. Postal Service, I think, will resume. We've already seen Western Union. They're actually moving along at a fairly good clip. Another source of mine saw Raul Castro last week, and Raul Castro said he just signed another set of agreements with the U.S. I think I'm not going to mention. I think I'll save that. But he actually was leaking to a friend. He was leaking to a friend to leak to me. It was very odd. They won't let me on the island. You know, I can't get a visa de prensa, but I'm still getting leaks. It's the most perverse. I'll tell you, this country is so. It's such a kind of anachronistic situation. And I said to this, so I said, what are you doing? He says, I'm leaking to you. I said, from who? He said, from Raul Castro. I said, lovely. Ask him where my visa de prensa is. Of course, well, the great thing about writing this book, by the way, as I must tell you, is this is the book I call Kiss the Visa Goodbye Forever. I decided that I'm done. I'm done crawling on glass for this. I'm just done. If they don't want to give me a visa, fine. I'm evidently still getting messages from them. And I just, and what happens with that is that reporters limit what they're doing. They trade access for what they write, because every piece is scrutinized. I found out that I was detained when I last went there last year, not because of the political content of my last book, Cuba Confidential, but as maybe one of the highest people in the Cuban government told one of my sources, he said, what did he say? He said, Fidel, no le gustó el libro. He said, and he said it was the personal things that I discussed, mentioned who his children were, identified the children and the wife. I went, my God, this is normal, typical information that is known about any foreign leader. What is his problem? But it wasn't anything I said that he executed this one or he made a mistake here. It was because I mentioned the name of his wife. So we see this is it speaks to the fact that this extraordinary man, this man of titanic intellect and ambition, the likes of which we will probably never see again. This is still a very capricious system that he runs. And by the way, I just wanted to say, we have Raul running the government, but Raul Castro is never going to do anything. He's never going to go against his brother. That is the relationship. I've seen it demonstrated right in front of my eyes between the two brothers. Fidel, even as convalescent in chief or pundit in chief, where he writes these reflections columns every week, Raul is not going to defy his brother. He will move and moderate, and they argue. They have been arguing from the gate. They have a very interesting sibling relationship, but at the core of it is complete devotion. And he will go so far, but Fidel Castro will keep that veto power until he's under the ground.
I think just to come back to your original question, I think what you may see is just a little different spin on how travel may open up. I think it is going to open up.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think, but the president has an opportunity to let Congress do the heavy lifting. A couple of travel bills are moving through both the House and Senate. They've got significant support, and it could be that, and those bills would end the travel ban altogether on all American travel.
Right.
Getting a good, strong, positive signal from Congress that, hey, we're behind you on transforming the relationship with Cuba would be very nice political cover for Obama to really work on the other aspects of the bilateral relationship that need to be worked on, and just take that kind of statement of support from Congress as a big chunk of political cover, because Florida is still Florida. There's a midterm election coming up. That type of support might be very useful to them.
But the other thing about Florida, as we know, is the polls have changed dramatically. I'm at, as I said, this Brookings Cuba Study Group, and the man who sometimes sits next to me is a man named Pepe Hernandez. Pepe Hernandez is president of the Cuban American National Foundation. I knew about him as a reporter because he had purchased the sniper rifle, or his that was used in an attack or would-be attack in the famous Esperanza case on Fidel Castro. And this is a transformed man. He, as he says, I was the exilio histórico. And he is now a man who wants to have dialogue. So we have seen and is encourages. Of course, he has a lot of worries and he wants it to go at a certain pace. Carlos Saladrigas, who runs the Cuba Study Group, who was very much a man of the right. So you are seeing a lot of these people who lived and died by the U.S. embargo, can never be touched, who are now ready to dismantle it, carefully, by piecemeal, but they are there. So the ground has shifted tremendously in Florida, and we've seen Lincoln Diaz-Balart, his brother Mario, and even Ileana Ross-Langton, who are the Congress people representing 3 districts in Miami, almost getting pushed over. Now, somebody made a comment, and again, what's very interesting is how Miami and Havana almost always replicate each other. So you have these ancients in Havana running the government. You have the Ramiro Valdez, Esteban Lasso. You have people mostly between 75 and 82, right up at the top. Well, in Miami, it's not so different. What are the big advertisers on all the right-wing radio stations in Miami for Mombi? It's Viagra. I mean, it's all the it's Geritol. I mean, all the advertising is for the elderly. So it's very interesting to me that the far left and the far right are getting older and older and older. But what we see in the crowds when we have a concert, say by Juanes, is you see the majority of Cubans. You see, but who are most of? We're all under 50, right?
Mm-hmm. Peter
Kornblum, National Security Archive. Subpoena or no subpoena? Man.
I knew you were going to get there, Peter.
I have to ask about the case of Luis Posada Carriles.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to be standing trial, we think, presumably maybe, early next year, on charges that were originally immigration fraud and lying to immigration authorities. However, on the basis of your contribution of evidence, charges against him were added about lying about his role in the hotel bombing cases in 1997. And I understand that you may have difficulty talking about the evidence per se, so I'm not going to ask you about the evidence, but I am actually interested in your assessment of the importance and motivation of adding these particular charges. They were added after the Obama administration came in. It's not clear if this was something that the new Justice Department had decided to do, or if the old Justice Department under Bush had set in motion. And obviously they have implications for U.S. Cuban relations, and it has implications for finally moving forward in a very indirect way on getting evidence into court about Luis Posada and terrorism. So I'm interested in your assessment of the addition of these charges and what they mean in general terms, how they came about, and where they might lead us.
How about implications for me? Never mind them. But I knew you were going to go there, Peter. And all right, Luis Posada Carriles.
If it's easier to talk about what Raul said, feel free.
Yeah. Tell you what Raul said. The trial is scheduled for March 1st of next year. As some of you know, they went after him under the Alberto Gonzalez Justice Department and George W. Bush, and they pursued an immigration case. At the same time, there was a grand jury convened in New Jersey. And I don't think that was by accident why they picked New Jersey, aside from the fact that there were names on a certain fax that we published at the New York Times in 1998, and the names of those people who were transmitting money to Luis Posada were based in Union City. That was a criminal federal terrorism grand jury. I'm speaking broadly in lay terms. I may have some of the legal language not exactly right, because I'm not a lawyer. And so it was begun under Alberto Gonzalez. those 3 new charges, yes, they appear to be gratuitous. What are they doing? And basically, it's an immigration case. Certainly, I don't appreciate it because I don't know anything about the immigration of Louise Posada. Our story in the New York Times, and I need to say this, I was a co-writer with Larry Roeder, who was the Caribbean bureau chief. He deserves a lot of the credit on this. And it was a series on exile militants, and Louise Posada just kind of fell our direction. One day I came home and I called in and there was a message from him on my answering machine. But he came in the middle of the story. The question is what's going to happen in the New Jersey grand jury situation. I frankly think that the Justice Department, and there are, I think, conflict issues between what the Gonzales Justice Department wanted to do, which was basically get rid of it because George W. Bush's administration wasn't particularly interested in prosecuting Posada, and this administration. I could be wrong, I don't think those 3 additional charges that involved me in the New York Times would have probably been tacked on if the current administration had been too involved. I think it happened I don't think you can assume that one's Obama and one's Bush, et cetera. I think that could be mistaken. I think their approaches are kind of different and what their priorities are. In other words, this administration appears to have much higher regard for the First Amendment issues. Why do I not want to be involved in the case of Louise Posada? Because I'm a reporter. It's not because I think he's innocent or guilty or good or bad or evil or da-da-da. It's because sources talk to reporters and they expect that this material will be published. They do not expect to be then called to testify against them. And we remove that and we end that, and reporters have to testify against sources. Well, guess what? Sources are going to stop talking to reporters. It's that simple. It's that important. I can't speak more passionately about it. I deeply resent this subpoena. We've been fighting them for 4 years. We had a big victory last week where the judge threw out the request of Posada's lawyers for every piece of paper and hard drive, you name it, at the New York Times. I mean, this is how intrusive this has been. What's really appalling in the Posada case is that in 2003, in the summer of 2003, the Miami FBI, which had an extraordinary case collected, meticulously put together by some of the finest agents in the Joint Terrorism Task Force. They had put together a remarkable case, but the agents involved became demoralized. They said that we can't get anything going here. We've been working on it. We've interviewed Posada. We put together all this information. They had the original facts. They had the original facts that Posada had sent with his name on it, the whole thing. They left because they couldn't stand anymore that the Miami FBI was really not doing anything in the Justice Department. They went on to other areas. But they put this evidence and these files in 5 boxes, they tell me. They put them in a room known as the bulky, which is where the storage of vital information is put in the FBI in Miami. And they put on one box something, I think it was something saying crucial or very important evidence. Well, in 2003, when Luis Posada was in Panama being detained, or he was in prison at that point for an attempt to kill Fidel Castro in Panama, somebody in Miami decided, and you would need the signature, you would have to have it signed off by the then U.S. attorney, who was, Marcos Jimenez, I believe, and also the SAC of the special agent in charge, or somebody pretty high up in the Miami FBI. They decided, well, we're going to close that case. And by closing that case in the summer of 2003, they greenlighted the destruction of all that evidence. And that stuff went to the shredder. That was meticulously put together after years of work. And that, to me, begs an investigation for obstruction of justice. What happened? Who gave that? When I first called the FBI, and I found out about it when I was reporting for the Atlantic piece on the Cubana shoot-down, I called there and I said, well, who closed the case and who why? And the first response I got was, well, no one knew where he was. I mean, he disappeared. I said, what do you mean no one knew where he was? He was in prison for an attempted assassination on Fidel Castro. I mean, it was a headline front page story. The Miami FBI didn't know this. And then the next thing was, well, the case seemed to fall apart. I said, what do you mean? Well, in my book, in part 2, this is discussed chapter and verse, and that's what I would ask this Justice Department, is we need to have an investigation about who closed the Posada case in the summer of 2003 and who sent those materials for destruction. Now, I don't want you to think that all Posada files were destroyed. A lot of people get this confused. The FBI keeps files forever, but this was vital evidence. The original facts and other materials. It devastated morale in this thing. So I wrote a piece when I started writing pieces saying Luis Posada's in Miami. Did anyone notice? I think he's about to buy a condo. As far as I know, he's a fugitive. And this was published in the Washington Post here in Outlook. And then I did another piece. Well, they got kind of embarrassed. And they eventually picked up Posada in Miami. But my point is what are you doing hauling in reporters in the New York Times and media institutions to do your work as for prosecution when you have closed the case and destroyed the evidence? Or not all of it. I don't want you to think that. They have reconstructed the case, and from what I hear from people inside the other side, the Posada camp, and some of the other defendants, one of the lawyers said to me, the evidence they have is staggering. Now, whether they're going to go forward, I think what the more likely they're going to do is dump it on Italy. And Italy has a very proactive a judge involved with this case, and they will make it Italy's problem. Because remember, in the Havana bombings in 1997, there was an Italian who was killed.
Okay, great. We got a nice stack of questions in the back, and then right here in the red sweater, and then right up front.
Yes, hello, Ms. Bardach. My name is Jim Moore. I'm unaffiliated. A couple of years ago, I read a piece about a conflict in Central Africa. And in that in New York Times, in that piece, there was a little blurb about Cuba having developed this capacity to deliver medical services in conflict zones. They've got this capacity that's not found in a lot of places around the world.
Yeah.
Is that true, number one? I don't know if that's true. Yeah. And then number two, if that is true, is that an opportunity in U.S. Cuban relations?
I'm just going to take a Kleenex from it. You can hand me if there's a clean my purse. I'm sorry. I can't tell you I'm acquainted with that particular operation. I can only tell you that doctors are probably the number one export from Cuba. More people are Cuba has more doctors than any other country in the hemisphere. They export them everywhere. They're very well appreciated. A lot of them take that opportunity to also go on and defect. A lot of them have arrived in Miami and other countries. But they have certainly been a big bonus, Cuban doctors to around the world, to a lot of recipients. And of course, Cuba has a very unique relationship with Africa because they intervened in the war in Angola. They lost at least 5,000 Cubans. Some people say 50,000. I don't know the figure exactly. And so they did create a welcome environment for themselves. And of course, on the positive side of the ledger, Nelson Mandela credits Fidel Castro, says that his intervention in Angola, which was very unpopular in Cuba, and as I said, a very large loss of Cuban life, but Nelson Mandela credited that intervention as helping liberate and end apartheid in South Africa. I can't speak to that particular operation. I don't know, but it sounds like something they would do very well.
Quickly, what I know of the program, they have a very extraordinary capacity to field doctors and nurses into very impoverished areas in developing countries, and are doing that as part of their foreign policy. So it's a very active program. One of the capacities they do have is to go into disaster areas. I've heard mostly that they go in to natural disasters, and the great example here is the Pakistan earthquake in Azad Kashmir province a few years back, in which they fielded 6 essentially MASH units, and were able to go in, and they actually even had, I think they had a dedicated all-female team that could help because of the separation of the genders in tribal Pakistani society. So they were able to go in and, as a result, opened up diplomatic relations with Pakistan for the first time. So they've been able to do those kinds of things. Right now, a Cuban-staffed and supported hospital is being shut down in Honduras, supposedly, at least from the articles I've seen, as a result of a backlash against the program supported by President Zelaya. And this is it's an indigenous. I'm forgetting the name of the indigenous group. The Carifuna, right? Carifuna hospital, and it's being shut down by the military because of its previous support from Zelaya, but it's staffed by Cubans. So they may find themselves in conflict. I haven't heard about a kind of a war zone specialty that has been developed, but if anybody else has, please chime in.
They offered aid to the U.S., which in the administration of George W. Bush, in their usual tone-deaf way, said, "No, we don't want any help. We're doing just fine here with Katrina."
Okay, right here in the front, and then and then the man in the red sweater, and then that'll be it.
Annie, my name's Jose Pertierra. I represent the government of Venezuela, as you know, in the extradition case of Luis Posada Carriles. I, like Peter, I'm not going to ask you about the evidence because I know you're under subpoena. I'm not going to ask you what statements Posada made in that tape that you recently discovered that he had made. You said they were more damning than the previous one.
I think some are in the book, Jose.
Yeah, but the ones that I'm more interested in are not in the book, but I'm not going to ask you about that. But I am curious because you talked about the need for an investigation as to the destruction of the file, which I think is very interesting. It's very telling that Posada has friends. It's very difficult to extradite him, as you know, because he has friends in high places. And one of the things that I think that needs to be done is an investigation not only of that, but of the manipulation by the U.S. government of its own judicial system throughout this Posada case. As you know, they, instead of extraditing him to Venezuela, they instead instituted immigration proceedings against him, and they looked for and got an order from an immigration judge saying he could not be deported to Venezuela or Cuba because he allegedly would be tortured there. And they got that by failing to cross-examine the only witness that Posada Carriles used in the immigration case, Joaquin Chafardet, the only man to say that he would be tortured in Cuba or Venezuela. Had they cross-examined him, they would have discovered that he was a colleague of Posada's. He was a lawyer for Posada in Venezuela.
He was a business partner. They were business partners in ISICA, which was his own private agency, and they both worked together at DECIP. Jose, I happened to be at that arraignment, and it was astonishing. It was one of the most astonishing. I was there as a reporter with other reporters, and we were all sitting there saying, "What is going on here?" And because the lawyers for Posada mounted their case, they had a bunch of their witnesses there as usual, and they had Joaquin Chafardet there, who said that he was going to be tortured if he was sent to Venezuela. And then they turned to the U.S. Justice Department and they said, "Well, your cross-examination." They said, "None." And, of course, we're all sitting there saying, well, maybe you will want to point out that Joaquin Chafardet is a very good witness, but he's also, as you said, the business partner of Luis Posada. He was in ISICA. They were at DECIP together. He was his attorney. He was
indicted for helping Posada escape in 1985.
This is true. He was indicted but not convicted. There was nothing. And this went on throughout the entire arraignment. We were sitting there for 2 days. I'll tell you something even more, and a lot of this is laid out in part 2 of this book, so we're sitting there incredulously saying they would not file any case. And the more mysterious thing to us is that the lawyers representing the government kept leaving the courtroom and going upstairs. And I finally said to somebody on their team, I said, "Where are they all going? Because they're not putting any witnesses on." He says, "They keep calling Washington." This is during the Gonzales era at the Department of Justice. They keep calling Washington because they need to know direction. I said, They're running out of the courtroom every 10 minutes. How much direction do they need to have? And so on one of the breaks, I go to the ladies' room. This is in El Paso. I'm in the ladies' room. Next thing I know is two of the government lawyers are in the bathroom with me. And they're saying, and Louise Bardach, we need you on the stand. I said, you need me on the stand? What do we need me to on the stand? I said, why don't you ask a few questions? And they said, no, we need you. We need you to say that Luis Posada told you this and that. I said, mount your own case. I mean, there I was, ambushed in a bathroom, and it was astonishing. I'm stuck in the bathroom. I'm calling the lawyers for the New York Times. I said, you're not going to believe this. I'm in a bathroom stall. I got two Justice Department lawyers. They haven't asked a single question. I can't get out of this bathroom. And it was astonishing. And then I get out there, and then they finally put Posada on the stand, which is how they got these three charges, is they said to this man, they said, is it true you told Anne Louise Bardach in the New York Times that da-da-da-da-da-da, that you bombed this or whatever. I'm paraphrasing, whatever you did, that you did this attempts, and of course, what would you do if you were Luis Posada? He says, no, of course not, And now, of course, that turns into a perjury issue. And again, it comes out of the U.S. government not having whatever you want, the cojones, whatever you want, to mount their own case after. And I really feel so strongly about what happened in 2003 that we really need an investigation into what happened there, who ordered the closing. We know that a man named Hector Pesquero was the SAC of the FBI. After all the agents who were really quite dedicated in the case left, he put his son as the point person in charge of the case. Now, we don't know, the order to close it and shred it needed the approval of the U.S. attorney, and it needed somebody higher up in the FBI. And I think it's really a case that needs to be looked into. And, of course, in the Miami media, no one wrote about it because, the Miami FBI told everybody, it was just a routine investigation. They said it's a routine cleaning. We needed to clean out the bulky. Now, if you were doing a routine cleaning of your closets at the FBI, would you take the case of the number one most notorious figure in the Cuban exile militant arena as the case that you would shred to make some space? Wouldn't you take a carjacking from 10 years ago? I mean, this is what they chose for the so-called routine cleaning in Miami. You can see I'm upset on this issue.
We've got one more question from...
Fariborz Fatemi, Oxfordshire Group. Change the subject for a moment.
Excellent.
After half a century of embargoes and sanctions, how effective have they been in these policies have been in altering Cuban behavior? Can you comment on that?
Nothing. What I conclude in the part 3 of this book, that what's really happening is that the greatest superpower in history, the United States, in their 50-year showdown with a Caribbean island, are going to walk away from the table pretty much empty-handed. But we're going to, all the things that they said that they wanted and insisted and demanded, and the goalposts, what we're going to get is some good relations. And I really am convinced by the end of Obama's first term, we will be back to where we were under the Clinton administration. It will warm up. I wouldn't be surprised. There's a couple things that might happen if there's an Obama's second administration. We might see them remove Cuba from the list of terrorist nations. They're on the Beyond the Evil list of terrorist nations, which is really kind of ridiculous because, Saudi Arabia is not, on it with the 9/11 hijackers, and Pakistan, and, but Cuba's on it, with Iran. And that's very ridiculous, and the CIA and all the national security organs really are befuddled by it. They'll probably have one of those organs, remove them from the list. What will probably also happen is they'll establish the ambassadors. They'll put the ambassador, so we don't have this charade of interest sections, which are really like that. But remember, this is going. The U.S. embargo worked brilliantly for Fidel Castro. I was told this by dissidents when I first got there in the 90s, early 90s, that Fidel Castro wants the U.S. embargo. And we can see this strategically through the years. Every time they was about to close, he did something to make sure that embargo stayed in place.
We'll do that again?
They do not want, the U.S. embargo works brilliantly because if you are running a repressive, authoritarian country, you do not want unfettered trade and contacts. You need it very controlled. You need to keep it, the controls, and you can see this in the.
Do you think they would do it again? Do you think they would try to, Brothers to the Rescue style?
I think that card has been played, but they are getting exactly what they want. They're getting it limited. They're getting it slow. They're getting it controlled because they cannot. And first of all, Cuba does not have the infrastructure for unfettered trade. I mean, if you ever talk to people who own the hotels, they said they don't even have the airport to handle this. There is no road system. The autopista, when you drive on the autopista in Cuba, you're on the road with no lights, with a bunch of cattle, donkeys, horses, a lot of drunken people on bicycles. I mean, and potholes the size of your car. They need a major infrastructure, and Raul Castro has talked about replacing the highway system and the road system as being absolutely crucial. They are not ready for tourism prime time as we know it, say, in the Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico. They need a lot of repair work, and they need things to move slowly and incrementally.
Well, on that note, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Louise Bardach, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.